everybody once again. This will be chapter 5 of Arizona Springtime, and we'll jump right in. Chapter 5, Contrasts in Springtime. Spring differs depending on where you are geographically. College offered short breaks from study during springtime. Spring breaks during my college years were a reason to travel and witness spring in new settings. I hiked and traveled during spring breaks and left the college life behind, only temporarily. I chose trips that included whole new worlds with as much nature and as few people as possible. As a witness to spring in Chicago as a youngster and spring in Phoenix as a young adult, there was more to spring than just the latitude. Within Arizona, spring weather changes with altitude. Northern Arizona has a colder spring than does Yuma in the low desert. Spring in most of America meant an end to winter as spring weather changed the natural world. One year, as spring break approached, while I attended university in Arizona, Mark, a friend from my high school years in Illinois, traveled to Arizona for a visit. He was also on break while pursuing his doctorate in psychology. Both of us had enjoyed years of friendship, including travel with excursions centered on photographing nature. Just after high school, we had traveled to photograph the splendid fall foliage in northern Illinois. A year after that, we drove out west from Illinois during summer. We traveled into South Dakota and the Black Hills, then into Wyoming, up to Colorado and the Rocky Mountains before circling back home. This particular spring, we decided to take a quick trip to the Pacific Ocean and into Southern California. Along the way to San Diego via Los Angeles, we stopped at San Juan Capistrano. It was there that I saw a couple of cliff swallows and wondered if they were the first to arrive from Argentina. They arrive in mid-March, and it was possible they were the historic mission's famous birds. Mark and I took out our cameras and walked around the bell tower. Near the tower was an agave in bloom, and the photograph highlighted the profuse, delicate, bright, whitewashed flowers, contrasting the elegant, somber, red brick arches of the historic tower. We continued the drive south to Del Mar and arrived there late in the afternoon. We thought it might be nice to stay at the Del Mar Motel on the beach because it was welcoming to low-budget vacationers. The hotel was originally popular among surfers because it was on the beach. I had not called ahead for a room, but it was easy to get a room. The rooms were modest, but the scenery was outstanding. The next morning we drove along the coast to take pictures. It was my first visit to the Pacific Ocean. The ocean water was surprisingly cool because of the California stream that originates in the cold waters near the Alaskan Aleutian Islands. Driving along the coast, we saw a spot with waves crashing over rugged rocks. It seemed like a nice place to stop and try to photograph birds. We parked and walked around an outcropping of flat rock in line with the background of crashing waves. Standing one-legged near the edge of the flat rock, we photographed a California gull. The bird seemed oblivious to the crashing waves, but was more interested in the large eye of the lens pointed at it. The bird never moved while we lined up to photograph the bird in the foreground and an out-of-focus wave crashing behind it. Mark and I continued to walk along some higher cliffs. Atop was a group of people wearing brightly colored windbreakers. Some had binoculars raised to their eyes, and others were focused on looking far out to sea. Little did I know, they were probably whale watching. We found a red knot walking along the shoreline. It looked at me with skepticism as I walked around it like a fashion photographer finding the best angle. This particular red knot may have wintered around San Diego or was stopping on its way north. Either way, it would complete its spring migration to northern Alaska or Siberia. The red knot on the California coast does not migrate as far as the red knot of the East Coast. Ecologist Carl Safina explained that red knots migrating up the East Coast always make a stop at Delaware Bay. They time the stop for an all-you-can-eat buffet. The bay is one of the areas along the eastern shore that female horseshoe crabs come ashore to lay their eggs. Upwards of 80,000 eggs are laid by each female horseshoe crab. The birds arrive to eat the protein-packed eggs that have been buried under the sand by the female crabs. The red knots, in preparation to continue the long migration, must eat enough eggs to double their weight. This would equal about 135,000 eggs. Then the bird will travel up to northern Alaska or Siberia to nest. Young red knots are hatched in time to take advantage of the buffet of insects that blanket the area in early July. The red knot I saw in California had a much shorter migration. That bird just followed the coast to arrive at the same destination as their eastern cousins. Another bird Mark and I found along the cliffs was a Brandt's cormorant. It was a large bird, certainly larger than I had ever seen up close. The juvenile cormorant stood awkwardly under a cliff. There was just enough space to anchor itself against the cliff wall, with its webbed feet balanced precariously on a thin ledge. The large midnight black bird had shiny primaries. The bird looked at me with a large dark blue globe. I have always felt invasionary when photographing birds and animals. It is hard to balance the invasion with the need to document and record the magnificence of nature. There is no resolution, except to say this many decades later, I am glad I took the photographs. After that, we headed back to Arizona over Interstate 8 via Yuma. Just to the east of Gila Bend, we chose to take the old trucker's route, Highway 85 north to Buckeye. It was a remote highway with easy access to scenic house and ranch ruins, combined with exotic desert views. Sadly, now it's just another busy highway leading to a conglomeration of private prisons. Mark and I were fortunate to photograph what was then scenic, and the photographs have become artifacts. Spring in Arizona depends upon altitude more than latitude. Spring in central and northern Arizona is very different than spring in Phoenix. In Phoenix, early spring is very mild, and late spring sees a significant rise in temperature, along with the start of a dry season. In northern and central Arizona, the elevation changes are widely varied, but generally higher than Phoenix. Snow will fall during spring, and nightly low temperatures are below freezing. A couple of years after the drive to San Diego, I joined my future wife, Audrey, and our friend Bruce for a hike in north central Arizona along the Groom Creek Loop Trail near Prescott. From Phoenix, elevation 1,000 feet, I drove up Interstate 17 north to Cortez Junction. We stopped briefly to view Arcosanti, the original concept for an all-in-one sustainable living environment by architect Pauli Solari. His utopian architectural vision began in 1970, and construction is still ongoing. We continued along State Route 69 and passed a couple of old ghost towns, Humboldt, Dewey, and then drove through Prescott and then south at the Senator Highway. There was plenty of parking at the trailhead and no one else was around. The hike climbed Spruce Mountain starting at 6,300 feet, reached the summit at about 7,700 feet. The name Spruce Mountain appears on old maps and was named for spruce trees. However, there are no spruce trees. They're mostly pine and junipers. How did the old-timers misidentify other trees as spruce? The early prospectors, also the earliest pioneers in the area, weren't really looking up at the trees, they were looking down towards the ground for any quartz outcropping or streams to pan for gold. The earliest mining parties would have had an eclectic group of people from a wide variety of backgrounds. Timbermen and botanists who would have known the difference evidently were not members in those early mining parties. Along the trail we inspected an old timber frame mining cabin for a resident of the Groom Creek Mining District. This district was formed by a mining party after enough gold was found to stake claims. It dates back to the frontier days of Arizona. The square-cut timbers of the old cabin were standing, but all of the chinking had disappeared. There was a wood-framed window that was probably expanded from an original gun sight. A full-sized window during the frontier years would have been a fatal mistake. Arrows from Native American bows and bullets from outlaws were common enough to be a constant danger for the prospectors. I have read enough accounts to know the area was peppered with danger. Gold is what lured the pioneers, but they also prospected for silver and copper ores if they knew the difference. The landscape setting for the old cabin was stunning. One wonders if the early pioneers took the time to appreciate their surroundings. Nominal hike leader Bruce and I climbed up a juniper to get a better look at the surrounding area. Tree climbing was one of the tensile connections with nature that I enjoyed most when I was very young. The view overlooked an undulating sea of pine and juniper trees, thick to the horizon. On the ground the trail climbed noticeably, but not too steep to strain. There was a fragrance of pine and the spent needles cushioned the trail. To this day, many of the same trees growing decades ago are still standing. Fire has devastated large areas of forest in Arizona in the ensuing decades, including near Spruce Mountain. So far, the mountain has been spared. The fire lookout is at the top of Spruce Mountain. It was built in 1936 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Though now we understand the important role of wildfires in its renewal of the land, it is comforting to know these trees still stand decades after the hike. The return trip took us down a switchback highway that straightened out near the ghost town of Congress. We drove back to Phoenix through the old town of Wickenburg, Arizona. That's the end of Chapter 5. See you soon for the next chapter.